What we're trying to do is we're trying to precisely activate very specific pathways. And this is really where plant medicine, I think, really shines, because it actually allows this opening, almost like this blank canvas. And then the individual goes through their own thought processes and experiences through, because if you could take plant medicine, you could do a journey, right? But if you don't actually go through the process, the journey is going through these processes in the mind, right? Maybe re-experiencing the death of a loved one, or re-experiencing some negative experience that you've had in your life, but seeing it in a different way. And then those nerves are going to literally fire through the brain. And now you have this other connection, this other brain cell, right, that you didn't have before, that allows you to be able to, from then that point forward, see it in a different way.
I just want to provide an opening for you to introduce yourself to our audience, just so they have a little background on who you are and what brought you from still point breathing into plant medicine and the stuff that we're going to focus on today, which is neuroprotection as it relates to working with plant medicine.
Well, Paul, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your show. I've been listening to your show for a while now, so it's kind of amazing to actually be a guest. So thank you for that. I graduated as a chiropractor in '96, and then shortly after went to naturopathic school, and what you would call a chiropractic neurologist. And so we do something called functional neurology, and I think it's really more like real neurology. Unfortunately, these days, a lot of our neurologists are great diagnosticians, but all that really leads to is the latest prescription, that the pharmacies are promoting, right? So I'm not a big fan of drugs. And, I know I've heard you talk about the 5-HT1 receptors versus the 5-HT2A receptors, which we can dive into today. But, the problem with drugs, and so, well, let's back up. So functional neurology, what is it? It's a process where we use different manipulations, different ways of activating the brain to create neuroplasticity, to allow the brain to start functioning normally again. So, like, I'll give you an example. I just treated this young girl that came to me from California, and she has a rare neurologic disease called palatal myoclonus. And I've been lucky enough to kind of stumble on being able to correct that and treat more of those cases than anyone else. It's one of the things I'm really, really proud about. But I do a variety of these different treatments to these patients, and there's an area in their brainstem that doesn't fire. So there's not the ability for these nerves to really flow through properly. So we use different head and ocular reflexes to allow those nerves to kind of circumvent that. And then it kind of just gets rid of this movement disorder that these people have in their throat. And so functional neurologists will use natural functional applications. And you can't achieve a lot of these types of healing with people through drugs, because they're globally going to suppress or globally excite. What we're trying to do is we're trying to precisely activate very specific pathways. And this is really where plant medicine, I think, really shines, because it actually allows this opening, almost like this blank canvas. And then the individual goes through their own thought processes and experiences through, because if you could take plant medicine, you could do a journey, right? But if you don't actually go through the process, the journey is going through these processes in the mind, right? Maybe re-experiencing the death of a loved one, or re-experiencing some negative experience that you've had in your life, but seeing it in a different way. And then those nerves are going to literally fire through the brain. And now you have this other connection, this other brain cell, right, that you didn't have before, that allows you to be able to, from then that point forward, see it in a different way, right? And so that's really the magic of neuroplasticity. There's called dendrites. They're branches that grow off of nerves, And so it grows new connections. So look at a child, right? You look at a child, and a child might have way more neurons than, say, an adult. But you take a good, solid, functional adult, somebody that's got a high level of intelligence, and you look at that person and say, well, that person is so much more functional, but they have massive amount less of neurons versus a little baby or a kid. Why is that brain functioning at such a peak level? It has everything to do with being able to grow these new connections and develop this neuroplasticity. And plant medicine hyper accentuates that process.
And I want to dive deeper into that because there's upsides and also maybe some downsides to that hyper accentuation, which is where the neuroprotection comes in and some of the integration protocols that we can integrate. But before we get to that, I'd love to just lead with your story a little bit about how did you come to plant medicine? When did that sort of enter your life, and why did you start to work with it in an intentional way?
Yeah, well, so the first time I did psilocybin, I was 11. Okay,
You were
and
11 years
it
old.
was, yeah, I
Wow.
was a baby, and my friend had some really liberal parents, and he found a High Times magazine, and he's like, "Oh, we're gonna go to these cow patties." And we woke up at like 3 a.m. It's dark, rode our bikes up, and it's like still misty and foggy, and we picked all these mushrooms, and we consumed a lot of them. We really had no idea what dosage. We literally just put it all in the blender. It was my job to go back home and prepare it. So I'm thinking, orange juice, blend it up. You know, it's like this green, nasty orange juice, right? Show up with a big thermos. We're like at this little, what do you call, like a little park, right? With our skateboards at that moment. And so we guzzle all of it back and forth as much as we can guzzle. And then we get on the bus and we head to, this is in Hawaii, Ala Moana Center, which is like a mall.
Oh my God.
Well, why wouldn't that be a great idea, right?
Yeah.
So it went on so Hawaiian psilocybin is not as strong as the normal psilocybin. So it really wasn't as big of a deal that we consume so much, because that's kind of how you consume those particular mushrooms. But they last a really long time, like 8-9 hours. So it really seemed like forever. And we laughed. I mean, we were on the ground laughing. It was really a fun experience after I got through the first, bus ride wasn't so fun. But then once I got with my friend and we kind of connected, but it was never really in the context of the setting of really doing that inward journey. And it really wasn't until about 3.5-4 years ago that I was invited to come to someone that was doing a very, very special protocol. And this protocol was a combination of a few different medicines. And the people are very professional. They've been doing it for a long time, so it was a very legit situation, and it was just profound for me. They let me record the which I would recommend anybody going into a journey, if you can put a audio device on and actually record, because you might vocalize some of the things that you want to remember. And so then I journaled afterwards, but the downloads of just my life and just perspective on the past and what might be good directions for me in the future, and just the feeling of being one and knowing that there's beings that are watching over me that are just pure love, and they've always been supporting me. They're just profound experiences that bring you such a sense of well-being and warmth at a deep level. And that experience really changed me. I did experience a couple of more journeys after that, following up on that. And I just feel like I'm absolutely a different person. And I feel so much more connected to the planet. It's something that I would recommend anybody that has the opportunity to experience. It can be life-changing. It was for me.
And for so many of us, and you also come at it from a very unique perspective with the functional neurology background, and being a clinician yourself. There's also an opening there and a question of, now that I've had this experience, probably the next sort of thought that comes after that is, and how can this experience potentially help the clients that I'm working with? Because my sense in having spoken with you at length a couple of different times is that you work with some very unique use cases. Some, people who have maybe tried everything else, nothing works. They'll come to you because you have a very sort of it's innovative and unique to you. And so,
Mm-hmm.
we know that ketamine is now legal for clinicians to use. The rest of the ones will be FDA approved within the next few years. But after you have this profound opening and this profound experience, you would send over a PDF, which we will share as well, around neuroprotection.
Mm-hmm.
What was that experience for you like from a neurological perspective? What was integration like for you in coming back from that? And what protocols have you started to develop from your own experiences because you think they'll be helpful for others?
So I had that profound experience, that first journey, and I felt terrible for a couple of weeks afterwards. It was like this, some pretty strong heart opener medicines, and so the hangover, the neurologic hangover, was extreme for me. So it was very difficult for me to start integrating right away because I just felt very little motivation. I felt a bit of anxiety, and a little depressed, right? So the next time I went for my experience, I figured I would try something to see if I could mitigate some of those side effects. And so I tried using some products. So I should probably disclose this. So I have a company called Zen Scientific, and we make a variety of different, very unusual and kind of specialized suppositories. We make some liposomals. We have some various nasal sprays. And really, when I first started designing a lot of these products, they were more geared towards people with different neurological conditions. And, we treat a lot of patients with Lyme and, lots of inflammation, right? So a lot of these products weren't initially designed for them, but we were able to plug them into some protocols that have become very well used and accepted from a number of different facilitators. So what I found was there's some specific plant extracts that really what they're geared towards. So we should probably kind of back up a minute. So the brain has immune cells in it, and those immune cells are called microglial. Okay. So typically with in pathogens, and heart openers, there's the idea that we're going to have all this serotonin released, and then the receptor sites are going to downregulate, right? So the brain's going to say, oh, we have all this serotonin, we don't need as much receptors. So then it downregulates the receptors. So then when now the serotonin drops back down to normal, there's less receptor sites, so there's less activation of serotonin receptors. And then it takes a little while for those receptors to kind of come back naturally over time. And so that gap until those receptors they come back, people will suffer from the symptoms of having low serotonin. This is the concept that has been pretty much the mainstay. And I would argue that that's probably not accurate. And this is a bit disruptive. And the reason that I think that is the case is because when the brain has a toxin or something that creates inflammation, the immune cells in the brain recognize that, and they're called microglial. And I call the microglial like a chihuahua with a bazooka. They're really tiny little, they're tiny little cells, but once they get pissed off, they'll start blasting away. And that's what actually causes more damage to the brain than the actual insult. Like, for instance, a football player hits their head, they're going to have some leakage with the blood-brain barrier and some activation to these microglial. And there's more damage to the microglial activation than the actual trauma itself. So the idea of settling down microglial activation is a huge part of a lot of pharmaceutical companies. And this is a big part of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and how a lot of these protein tangles start to accumulate in the brain. So anybody interested in preserving their brain and having a healthy brain needs to really consider being able to downregulate that microglial activation, especially if they're going into medicine. So I designed a product called Lucitol, which has like curcumin and something called fisetin, has lutein, resveratrol, green tea extract. I mean, these are all like your highest end polyphenols that are very, very anti-inflammatory. They're also calorie restrict mimicking. So people take them to help, they've been shown to extend life, right? And the reason being is they mimic fasting. So you've heard a lot of people about talking about how they're doing intermittent fasting and how that can extend life. And because that's activating something called autophagy, which is where you're cleaning up old cellular components, right? This is our cleaning mechanism. So these polyphenols actually do the same thing. They activate autophagy and cleaning of the brain. So there's really two powerful reasons that someone might want to take it surrounding plant medicine. Is one is it's going to calm down any inflammation or overexcitation of the brain as a natural anti-inflammatory, but it's also going to help clean out some of the old, right? So if you're looking to kind of go through medicine and have a fresh start, you want autophagy. And that's one of the reasons I think fasting helps people in rituals and religion, is because fasting is the strongest trigger to autophagy. And this is when your body literally just cleans itself out, right? Recycles. This is what you're looking for with a lot of your emotions and, your mental, spiritual self. So you've got the physical part, and it's going to support the energetic part, I believe.
And we've seen, with something like an ayahuasca dieta, for example, those are, those are rituals or practices that have been used for potentially hundreds of years, if not longer, in the Amazon to prepare someone for ayahuasca. When I've done psilocybin retreats in the past, or even my own experiences, I'll often fast the day of, as a way to totally go into that clean and clear. And I'll be honest, I haven't paid that much attention then to what comes after the experience. And for a little more context on that, when working, I've done some work within pathogens, and there can be like you were saying, for a week or so after, a few days after, just not the greatest mood. Psilocybin, though, and I'd love if you could speak to some of the differences here, because I think our audience is interested in the nuance between, let's say, the tryptamines and the empathogens, if you will, or even the lysergamides. When I do something like psilocybin, for a week or two after, I have this incredible afterglow. I feel really connected, and certainly my diet is very clean already. And I would be curious as to how, let's say, a specific supplementation regimen with, polyphenols and some of these other things that you're mentioning, how that would either elongate, because what feels true is that this afterglow period with psychedelics can be tied to this window of neuroplasticity, where a lot of suffering, if you will, comes from resistance or friction to change. And that with that open window of neuroplasticity, it feels like we can adapt and go with life where it's moving us, rather than having to be so rigid and so sort of resistant to whatever it is that wants to move through us. Now, that's obviously a very broad view. This isn't, I'm not diving deep into sort of the neurology of it, but I'm just thinking out loud in terms of that nuance between, let's say, an empathogen, a tryptamine, or even something like San Pedro, which is a phenylthymine. What's your perspective on that in terms of the different plant medicines and their different impacts on the brain? Is it sort of like a one size fits all in terms of looking at supplementation, or are there specific ways that we can support brain function depending on the substance or the medicine that we're using? Or even ketamine. Ketamine would be another one that's quite a bit different as an NMDA antagonist, I think it is, compared to like a tryptamine, for example.
They're Probably could. I can't say that I've delved into experimenting with all the different medicines, right? So, um, if you read the article that I sent you, on neuroprotection, these are going to really be the tryptamines and the empathogens are really more geared towards that, because that's where you get a lot of overexcitation. Ayahuasca. Um, that's a pretty powerful anti-inflammatory. Usually people feel pretty good after they do an ayahuasca journey. San Pedro is pretty mellow as far as there's not really a hangover with that. And psilocybin, I think some people could overdo it with that, and they could benefit from some neuroprotection. It just kind of depends on the individual. So the way that I understand it, and I'm not going to, I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm like the expert with this. I mean, I would say I probably am not the expert, but I have some questions and perspectives that I think are unique that I think will help some people, right? Um, so with that said, the way I understand San Pedro and psilocybin and LSD is those three are really the kind of the top of the pile as far as creating neuroplasticity, right? And what I understand about San Pedro is it can be a pretty amazing product to literally take for like a month or two straight. And some people that might be suffering from like sexual addictions or even just drug addictions in general, particularly where it's hard for them to achieve like dopamine levels and happiness, right? It takes more for them to achieve that feeling of happiness. I have heard through different experienced shamans that microdosing or even higher dosing of San Pedro over a long period of time can be really helpful. And the same thing with like copy, which is from the ayahuasca. There's some protocols that can be really interesting with even children, that are having nightmares, and like just one drop of copy for them to actually be able to sort through some of their nightmares. So there's some really interesting applications. With the way I understand it is LSD is probably the most powerful with neuroplasticity, and psilocybin kind of probably right after that. But it's just allowing the brain to communicate with all the different components of it, and usually when our brain is focused on a certain task or subject or event, there's very few pathways actually being fired. But then when the medicines open up, all the different parts of the cerebellum, the parietal lobes, the temporal lobes, the frontal lobes, like everything starts to fire and light up. So you have access to all this. It can create such a powerful neuroplastic change because it's not just rewiring it, but you're anchoring it to other parts of the brain. So it really gets solidified, I think, in the consciousness that way.
Do you have any experience with neurofeedback and that whole world? I'm going to go into my first neurofeedback session about a week and a half from when we're recording this. And that's a topic that I've been interested in more and more around how does that relate, or how can that even be combined with plant medicine and general neuroprotection? Because what I'm hearing from those who have gone through with neurofeedback is it's almost like the brain knows. And if you get the mind out of the way and the ego and the personality, that in creating greater connectivity between the brain and training the brain in certain ways, it will actually open up a lot of healing pathways that, maybe modern regular medicine might not have access to. So it's a bit of a random question, a bit of a tangent, but I'm just curious how, an external technology like that might support the work that you're doing with neurology in general.
Yeah, it really does. And it would support an individual in an integration standpoint as well. The way neurofeedback works is they'll put electrodes, around your skull. And so those electrodes can pick up on certain brain waves. and also certain areas of the brain. And so the programs are basically going to say, well, we want the left brain to activate a little bit more because the right's, a little bit too excited and the left is not as excited, right? So they can map all that and then they can have a plan of action that will balance your brain better, right? And maybe bring your high beta waves like more into like a theta, right? So calming it down a little bit. And so then there'll be like a reward that you'll get when the brain acts that certain way. It could be that you're able to control a unicycle, or it could be that certain music plays a little bit louder, right? And then you kind of lose the music when the brain goes off course. It's really, I think, a very high level of brain fitness. So I'm glad you're going to do it.
And I'm super excited. I'm working with someone who's top of the top. He helped to run 40 years of Zen when they were doing that program for many years. And it's just like a small private workshop that I'm doing in San Diego. And as part of it, the protocols are no cannabis for 2 weeks before, no cannabis for 4 weeks after, minimizing psychedelics 2 weeks before and 4 weeks after to, allow the brain to do what it needs to do. And I'm just generally curious how that will be. Trying out all these different modalities is fun, and to see how that's different than an ayahuasca experience, or how that's different than, I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I've done ketamine as a suppository with body work, which, Ben Greenfield has also spoken about, to see how that shifts. It's fun to play with all these different tools to become a more coherent, centered, powerful self in many ways.
Yeah. Well, Ben got that idea from me.
The body work? With the
ketamine suppository. Yeah.
It's a powerful one.
It's very powerful. We were interacting on the phone leading up into that nap. So I'm very familiar with that experience. And I'd like to propose something that maybe you and your listeners haven't heard.
Yeah.
There's a liquid called cerebrospinal fluid that surrounds and bathes your brain and spinal cord. And it carries neurotransmitters and oxygen and nutrients. And sometimes that doesn't flow so well, right? So have you been to a Joe Dispenza retreat?
I have not, no.
Okay. So he has the pineal breath, right? So there's a certain breath and you're locking in your chakras and you're like creating this kind of squeezing to push the cerebral spinal fluid up the spine into, activate the pineal. And the idea is to create a mechanical stressor on the pineal to activate these little crystals that then act as a radio receiver, which is what's happening when we're in medicine is our pineal is becoming very active, and the substance DMT that comes from melatonin, I believe, is, the spirit molecule that lets us actually see what's real. It lets us see the energy world that is invisible in the physical world. And so it's really interesting to really look at the flow of that cerebral spinal fluid and the result of something called cranial rhythm and the sacrum moving, right? And so there's something called cranial sacral motion. And there's a technique that I was privileged to experience firsthand late 90s, and it was called endo-nasal balloon adjustment, right? Have you heard of this? So it's a balloon that goes in the nose, and it literally like opens and releases all the cranial and facial bones. And it was profound. I mean, I felt just calm and centered. I had broken my nose in my youth, and it opened everything up. Like the constriction was completely open. And I just felt fantastic. So I took the training and I learned how to do it. So I've actually been teaching this technique for many years. And so we call it functional cranial release. And so what it is it's this cranial adjustment that releases this flow of cerebral spinal fluid. So one of the things I would invite people to consider is there's a variety of different types of cranial adjustments. There's cranial sacral therapy that you can get, but really, if they can find someone that does endo-nasal adjustments, this can be a real benefit moving into a celebration or a journey. The cranium, Michael Rice, we talked about before, he always talks about how he feels like the cranium is the antenna to the quantum, right? And we know that structure and function can be closely related, right? And so besides that, the flow of this liquid life, the cerebral spinal fluid bathing and carrying minerals and cerebral spinal fluid and all the different nutrients, that vitality can carry over to a higher level of consciousness. So my personal beliefs are, I call it the three-legged stool, right? So one of the legs of the stool, and this is my three-legged stool analogy of someone that really wants to achieve the highest level of function in this world, is that direct experience of God, right? That direct experience of oneness, right? This is the experience that some people might find without medicine, but I think medicine is the best way to achieve that, right? The next leg of the stool is going to be the vitality of the body, right? So how vital are you? Eating good nutrition, doing some intermittent fasting, maybe fasting into a ceremony, just overall taking care of your body, that's going to mean a healthier brain. That vitality will have a direct relationship to the levels of consciousness that you can achieve. And the third leg of the stool is really mastering the mind. We talked earlier about some of the work that Michael Rice was doing with true forgiveness, right? So there's tricks the mind can play, right? We get caught up in the illusion of the subconscious, thinking that that's actually a reality for us. And it doesn't have to be, right? So there needs to be work done in that area. But all of them have some overlap, but they're all extremely important, And so I would put the cranial and the cerebral spinal fluid kind of within that vitality leg, and a fairly important part.
I'll use myself as a personal example. I have a lot of tension in my neck and my jaw, some tightness in my face. I tend to be a little hypervigilant at times because of some patterning that I grew up with. And I've noticed that whenever, for example, I go and do body work with like a really great body worker, a lot of what he'll work on is my neck, my jaw, my face, my head, to open that up. So if someone's sitting at home and is asking, sort of even in a way to self-assess, like, is, the cerebrospinal fluid and, cranial sacral therapy, when might that be appropriate, and how might even someone find, a qualified practitioner or someone to work with when it comes to that?
It's a great question, Paul. And so I would say probably everybody in a civilized culture would benefit from this endo-nasal procedure to some level. It sounds to me like you could really benefit from it. So the jawbone is one bone, but all of the bones of the skull can move. So this hinge won't be lined up if the skull is what happens is it becomes more narrow. So this was pioneered by Weston Price and the Price Pottinger group, right? So Weston Price is considered the father of the raw food movement. And he was a dentist and he traveled all over the world. And what he noticed is that people in the Aborigines that were eating off the land and didn't have all the stressors of modern, society in the industrialized areas, their skulls were very wide. You can see that when you go out and see, people that are more living off the earth. And so they wouldn't have to have their molars removed, right? Or their wisdom teeth removed. They didn't get cavities, their bones were strong. And so he wrote a whole book. It's called On Physical Degeneration. And you can just see all the pictures and you can very clearly see people that, even twins, one that would live, in the Aborigine tribe and the other one was transplanted to an industrial area and just the crowding. So what happens is there's low-grade inflammation that might lead to mouth breathing. And so then the tongue isn't holding the maxilla up, right? And so these cranial sutures are just very similar to the teeth, where there's stem cells that wrap all around that tooth, root, so that you have stem cells between all the sutures in the skull. And so a subtle amount of pressure over time can completely change the shape of the skull. And so what this technique does, which is unique from any other technique, is the balloon is going in the nose and it's expanding from the inside out. And it's very common when this adjustment is delivered for people to hear a lot of cracking and popping. And there's a certain moment that is pretty intense, so things start to expand and that balloon starts to expand. And then there's this really intense moment. And then there's this big release. And then it's over. The balloon's removed. So it only takes a few seconds. But generally, people will get up and be like, "Wow, I can breathe so much better. I can see clearer." I had a well-known musician actually is in town right now, and we did his treatment the other day when we went to dinner together. And he's just like, "I feel so connected to the quantum." Like he was just so in. And we did an IV on him that I've been using. I'd like to say it's pretty rock star, this IV. So,
what's the IV?
I call it Luma Blue, right? Are you familiar with methylene blue?
Yes. Yep. And isn't Ted Akaosa? He talks a lot about that.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So he's got the troche, which is 20 milligrams.
Yep.
I run 500 milligrams IV. All right. At the same time, I have a catheter in the other arm running 660 nanometers of red light, which is the perfect frequency to activate the methylene blue. So you have something called photobiomodulation, right? So substances become activated by light. Curcumin is more of a blue light, but methylene blue happens to really be activated with this 660 nanometer with the red. So we do a high dose magnesium to kind of relax and open up the blood vessels. Then we do the methylene blue IV with the red light, which is it's literally the lasers in your vein, so, and then we put them in the closet with the red light panels. Then we use a CVAC, which is a lot like a hyperbaric oxygen, but it's changing the pressure. It's like this pod. And that's the protocol. So this really activates mitochondria like nothing I've ever seen. And so this particular individual was out at dinner after this IV and he received the balloons, and it was a pretty nice combination.
And just so our listeners know, what is methylene blue? Because it's been talked about a little bit, but I assume most of the folks who are listening probably have never heard about it or don't really know much of anything about methylene blue.
Well, it was the very first synthetic drug ever approved by the FDA.
Really?
And it was approved.
Wow.
The very first one, and it was approved for chronic urinary tract infections. So if you take a tablet of methylene blue, and the IV is the same thing, you're peeing blue, right? So it concentrates in the bladder, and so it robs the microbes from being able to utilize oxygen. So it's very antimicrobial. It's also antiviral. Especially when you combine it with the light, so this type of protocol could be pretty amazing for like HIV. I mean, we use it for Epstein-Barr, Lyme disease, cytomegalovirus, HHV6, really any virus. I know an individual that's using a similar protocol in California, and he's treating COVID and HIV and really has some pretty amazing claims with it. So I would kind of agree that the results seem to be pretty amazing. And I've got some pretty amazing technology at my clinic that we do, such as like 10-pass hyperbaric ozone and NAD IVs. And, we also do ketamine infusions in our clinic as well. But this particular protocol is really special. And I think that sick people can benefit, but I also think that maybe in the future, people will be receiving these types of treatments leading into a ceremony.
Well, and that was going to be my next question. I'm someone who, I have my things, but I don't have any chronic diseases. I don't have any major clinical indications or conditions, or, I'm generally very healthy, good energy, good sex life, all those sorts of things. And if I were to say, hey, John, I want to come work with you, and, like I have some hypervigilance and I have some tension in my jaw and my heart isn't as open as I want it to be. And, there's definitely things that I feel are lacking or things that could be opened up more. Like, what's that assessment like? I suppose would be the first question. How do you assess clients coming in? And then let's say for someone like me, what would be a really cool, unique thing to bring me through in terms of like a protocol that you yourself know? Like, if I were to look to you as being like, John is a healer or a master in X, Y, and Z, what would your sort of special protocol be as John Lieurance?
Well, if you had no particular issues, which you have some, you have some TMJ, right? Maybe you get some occasional headaches. I don't know, or some muscular involvement. So we could address that. To me, I think based on just this brief understanding of what's going on with you, the endo-nasal technique, the functional cranial release would probably resolve that, right? If we wanted to create a really high level of consciousness with you, I would think about taking you through this fast track fast protocol, where we load you with NAD, and then we have you fast with this Lucitol, which are all those plant polyphenols, to really dig a lot of this into the activation of the genes of autophagy and cleaning and recycling, to just really help clean out and prepare the brain. I think this methylene blue protocol could be good for anybody that wants to just get like a boost. I don't know that there's a real need for NAD IVs anymore. We formulated the first NAD suppository. It's called NAD Max. And so,
if you need any guinea pigs, just I'll let you know.
Didn't you try it?
I did the melatonin, which I do want to talk about in this conversation as well, because that melatonin is also your jam. So I did the melatonin suppository and I did the Lucitol. I think there's a Lucitol suppository, but I don't believe I've tried the NAD plus.
Okay.
So I'll have to give that a go at some point.
We'll have to send that out. The idea with suppositories, for those that might be listening to this thinking, I'll never do that. Well, why would you want to? Because if I take a pill or if I get an injection, there's something called peak plasma. So there's the level of that nutrient in my bloodstream for a certain period of time. So that's going to peak. And then you can say peak plasma for this particular nutrient given orally might be an hour. So your cells literally have 1 hour to collect that nutrient and then it's gone, right? But cells are kind of like black beans, like have you ever soaked black beans? You got to let the water soak there for like hours, right? You come back an hour later, like how much water actually made it into that black bean? And that's the same thing that happens with a lot of pills. That's why you have to keep taking them for so long, because there's very poor absorption. And besides the short peak plasma, you also have the breakdown of the nutrients through your gastric juices and your liver, something called first pass. So really very little of the nutrients we take orally actually get into our bloodstream anyway. With a suppository, you're bypassing all of that. And it's a slow bleed into the bloodstream over the course of 5 hours or more. And so literally the cell has 5 hours to absorb this certain nutrient. So that delivery method is so unique because you could do an IV that lasts for 5 hours, but who wants to sit there for 5 hours, right? I mean, that's kind of inconvenient, where you can put a suppository and you don't even know it's there. It takes like 2 seconds, it just slips right in. Wash your hands, and you just walk away and it's just, it's working while you're not having to really think about it. And so we hear from a lot of people that when they start using these nutrients through suppositories, like whether it's glutathione or NAD or some of these plant polyphenols that are all very poorly absorbed, all of these polyphenols, they really, not much of it gets into your bloodstream. So it's really profound to get that into the bloodstream through other delivery routes. But people really will notice, a much higher level of change, physical change in their body. So the NAD suppository is literally almost as much as what most people IV, maybe more than some people. And you don't even know it's there. So there's none of those side effects because it's such a slow absorption. And you're able to do it like 2-3 times a week if you want, right? Versus if you were to go to an IV, you pay $1,500. You'd have to sit there for 5 hours. And it's expensive, inconvenient. And so this is, I think, a comparable, possibly better way to up your levels of NAD. And so what NAD is going to do is it's going to support your mitochondria, because if you have bad sleep, a lot of mental, emotional stress, chronic alcohol or drug use, all of those things are going to really drain this NAD. But NAD gets drained just with having birthdays. So just the fact of getting old, we have less NAD as we get older. So if we can rebuild those levels of NAD, there's scientists that have looked at this and found that animals live longer, and there's more, much better mitochondrial function, which is the energy that your cells have. And that's going to show up in your brain and heart more than any other part, because your brain and heart are the two most metabolically sensitive organs in your body. So if anybody's particularly dealing with any problems with their brain or their heart, they really want to take a hard look at NAD, because it could really help them. And so then we make the high dose melatonin suppository, Sandman. And so I wrote a book called Melatonin Miracle Molecule. And we take a deep dive into a lot of things besides sleep with melatonin. And then I have a particularly awesome article, chapter on the pineal. And we really dive into a lot of some of the discussions we're talking about today in plant medicine, DMT, LSD, neuroplasticity, spiritual awakening, some of the science that Dispenza's doing. That chapter I'm particularly proud of, but it's a long book. There's 22 chapters, over 500 pages. So right now we have it available in a PDF that we can give away for free to your listeners. So you'll have to let me know what coupon code you want to put. But if you go to melatoninbook.com and then you put in the coupon code that we'll put in the show notes.
Third wave is the one word. Third wave is a coupon code. Will be perfect.
Third wave. There you go. And so you can download it for free. The book will be coming out in hard copy in a couple of months, and then we could have a special for that. But there's chapters on skin, gut, brain, mental, emotional, cardiology, reproductive. I mean, just almost cancer, everything that you can think of, the liver. Melatonin has a profound protective aspect to your body. So let's say that we lived in a perfect world. We live on an island. There's no stressors. There's no EMF, right? Everything's perfect. We're not arguing with anybody. We probably don't need a lot of melatonin, right? There's not a lot of light pollution. There's a lot of what I call melatonin headwinds, so we have to overcome them. We talk about those in the book. But melatonin is the ultimate stress buffer. So stress, what happens is universally, whenever we have stress, Paul, we're going to create inflammation. And so if we look at inflammation, we can break that down chemically and call it cytokines. So there's a certain collection of cytokines that would be related to a certain type of stress. Like if I get a sunburn, there's going to be a certain cytokine combination related to a sunburn, right? Where if I get COVID, you have the cytokine storm. Those are other specific cytokines, but all stressors are going to relate to some sort of cytokine. And when those cytokines hit the cell, they create a shift in the way that you can make energy, from a way of making energy that's normal to a primitive form of making energy called aerobic glycolysis. And that gives you about 10% of the energy capacity that you would normally have. And what happens is when that shift happens, melatonin is naturally produced in the mitochondria. Every single mitochondria in your body makes its own melatonin to buffer this stress. That's why it's such an important molecule, and that's why we see people taking really high doses, where we're dosing people up into the 200 milligrams. and not necessarily for sleep. Some people find it to give the best night's sleep ever. Some people don't find it to change their sleep much at all. But what I do know is that high dose melatonin is working on the body at some pretty extreme levels that I think most people, if they start looking at some of the research, the references that we go through in the book, and the melatonin is also part of my neuroprotective protocol. You look at the neuroprotection aspect of melatonin is profound. And so taking a high dose melatonin, like the Sandman product, the night of a journey, you're going to get a really good night's sleep, usually, which is sometimes hard, right? So if you can get a really good, deep, restful night's sleep that night and wake up feeling really refreshed, and on top of it, have this powerful neuroprotective aspect that you'll get from the melatonin, I think that that's a smart thing.
And there are probably some listeners who are going, but wait, I've heard that melatonin, it's a hormone. We're not supposed to take it. It'll impact overall sleep quality. Because there's been a lot of discussion around melatonin as, and I thought this even before we connected a few months ago. I was like, but I've heard that, I should only take melatonin if I'm trying to, help with jet lag, so to say. What do you say to that in terms of the listeners who might be thinking, but I heard melatonin is a hormone, and then if we take it, then our body can't produce it, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Well, I'm gonna just go officially on the record to say I think that there's a conspiracy against melatonin. And I'll tell you, one of the things that really makes me think that is if you look up melatonin and side effects, WebMD is going to give you a list of side effects: depression, anxiety, headaches, blah, blah, blah. What they won't tell you is when they did that research, when they did that study, those side effects were the exact same thing in the placebo arm. So it's a little misleading. And if you go in and, search degenerative neurologic disorder melatonin, right? And go to Google Scholar. So you're really looking at the research itself. What you'll find at the end of a lot of these studies is that the researchers are very surprised at how safe melatonin was, that there was no side effects. I mean, study after, whether it's in cancer or skin, gut, it's just universally, the scientists are saying it's like, this is so safe. We're not seeing any side effects. So there's no negative feedback loop with melatonin like there are a lot of hormones. So you can take melatonin. It's not going to, like testosterone, you shut down your own production of testosterone when you take it, and so you don't have that with melatonin. I've taken like 800 milligrams of melatonin every night for a year and then stopped cold turkey. And I still slept great. There was no fall off a cliff or anything like that, right? So there's no concern there. Now, is it dangerous to take really high doses, right? So people say, okay, well, my doctor said I should take 2 or 3 milligrams. They gave what would be equivalent to 150,000 milligrams to an animal, and they stopped the study. They said there's just no toxic effect to melatonin. So I can't see anything in the research that would suggest that there's any danger at all. If you're taking it for sleep, maybe you don't need that much, right? But that's not what I think a lot of people are interested in that gravitate towards this narrative. I think we see people that are looking to maybe reverse some damage that they have in their body, or gain a higher level of health, or be able to we live in such a stressful environment, Paul,
especially in the States, especially here in America. It's very stressful. It is like a fucking chamber of stress that we live in.
Yeah. So here comes melatonin to the rescue, right? So are you familiar with the word hormesis?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So you have what I call the familiar zone. This is like, we're in the familiar zone right now, probably. This is comfortable for us. We're having a great conversation. But let's say that you're you're an athlete and you're training at the gym, and maybe you do too much, right? So if you go out of that familiar zone into a zone where they call the hormetic zone, you're pushing it a little bit, where you're going to get more gain of muscle. Where if you go too little to that, you're not going to really get a change, right? So it's not enough activation or stimulation for those genes to be activated that help you get stronger. But then there's a limit to the amount of stress that one can have, where I call the danger zone. And this is where you have damage. You don't want to get into that. What melatonin does, it actually extends that ceiling so that we can handle more stress before we start getting into that danger zone. We can actually dip into a deeper level of hormesis. You might be able to work out harder, right? This is really, I think, the beauty of melatonin. And I think a lot of people looking at it for that reason. We weren't adapted to handle the stress. So we need something to support us to have the same level of health that we might have if we were living, without all these stressors.
Going back to ancestral wisdom, or, the way that we as humans evolved for tens of thousands of years before industrial culture hit, or even just the last 100 years hit, so to say, right? So melatonin helps us to find that sense of homeostasis, again, is what I'm hearing. That's actually appropriate for what we need as human beings.
Right. Because it's there to quench those cytokines, right? It's there to jump in and say, I'm still going to maintain your energy levels, even though you're like stressing me to the max. Here you go. And so you have the energy levels to deal with the hormetic stress. That's really, in essence, what it's doing. But there's even more. Like we don't.
You wrote a 500-page book on it, so there's got to be so much more.
We're just taking a little, we're dipping our toe in, We'll have to maybe do a follow-up podcast on
it specifically. Well, one last thing I want to talk about before we wrap up is Zen Mist. Because I think the product that you've created with Zen Mist is fascinating, and everyone I talk to about it now is so interested and curious about it. And some try it and they're not as big of a fan of it. I use it every morning in my meditations, usually one pump in each nostril. This morning I did 2 pumps in each nostril. I would love if you could just tell our audience about Zen Mist and how you came upon it, and because I think it's just so inventive and interesting.
I am so glad that we're going to talk about this, because if we would have missed this conversation and not talked, it would have been a tragedy, right? Because there's such amazing applications in medicine work with this particular product, right? So, hape, right? Anybody listening to this that doesn't know what hape is, it's a blend of Amazonian herbs, and there's a sacred tobacco called mapacho. And it's generally blown in up your nose with a particular device, and it burns extremely bad, right? And so the first time I had it done, I was like, hell no, I'll never do that again. In fact, it was miserable. I was like, I will never do that again in my life. Like, why would anybody do that to themselves? And then fast forward a couple of years, it was shortly after I did my first journey. And it was one of the facilitators out at this place. And she was just going on and on about how she loved doing hape. She'd do it in the morning. It just gave her this sense of well-being. And I'm like, wow, I'm going to be missing something, right? So I said, give me a little bit, right? And I took it back home with me. And I just took a teeny bit, and I just kind of sniffed it through a straw, right? And it was just like a tiny microdose. And I got it. Like, I felt it. And I'm like, now I see the upside to this. Like, I felt the calmness. I felt the focus. And we were already making nasal sprays with glutathione and NAD and things like that. So I'm like, this would make a great nasal spray. So I started working on, and we have 3 formulas. We've got the original Zen, which is really just straight mapacho, special mix. And it's our strongest version. And then we have an essential oil version, which is a bit minty. It's got some rosemary and some other herbs in there. And then we have another one that's CBD, Zen CBD. So there's 3 versions there. And so what happens is when you spray it up the nose, there's a burning that occurs. And that burning is actually activating your brainstem. And there's a nerve nucleus in the brainstem called the trigeminal nerve, and it innervates your eyes, your face, your sinuses, your mouth. And it's kind of how Sananga works as well, which is an eye drop that burns. So, which we're working on a Zenanga formula, which I'll be sending you a beta test here pretty soon.
I would love that. Thank you.
Yeah. So for those that might be kind of interested in trying the Zen, when you get the Zen, there's also oxytocin that we put in this product, which helps to support, this kind of calming sensation. But it works with the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is kind of the home of the parasympathetic nervous system. So the opposite of the parasympathetic nervous system is the sympathetics, which is that fight or flight, which we're always in. Most of us get stuck in that. And you kind of need to be somewhat in that to function and accomplish things throughout the day. And so we want to support that parasympathetic nervous system as much as we can. And so breath work is a great way to do it. And then activating the trigeminal nerve, right? You can stick your face in ice water. This actually does it pretty nicely. The Zen, that burning sensation, along with the actual medicine itself that gets absorbed through the nasal passage, that combination very powerfully puts you into a very calm state, a very focused state, but you're also alert, right? You've noticed that, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And it doesn't burn as much as normal hape.
And you don't get the throat drip near as much either. And normally with normal hape, you'll blow your nose and it'll be all of this powder that comes out. And with the Zen Mist, it's very clean and clear. There might be a tiny, but it's very clean has been my experience with it.
Yeah. And what's nice about it is it's so convenient. It's a little awkward to do hape, because, it has to be blown up your nose and it's a powder and blah, blah, blah. So when someone's actually in medicine, right? So when we've facilitated people in medicine, we'll offer them the Zen. And we do it in our clinic with the ketamine journeys as well. It's fantastic in ketamine journeys. So sometimes people get to a certain block. I like to utilize the Zen after like a good round of breath work. I had recorded a show with Ben, right? And he was a huge fan of Zen. And we went out there and we decided to do like this really, really solid soma breath work in a sauna. And we took our Zens in there, right? And so we're like doing this like hardcore soma breathing. And then right at the end, we inhaled and then we sprayed the Zen up the nose, held it, kind of did the holotropic sip, sip, sip into the third eye, full exhale, hold as long as you can. And I was like full on just in the quantum
Kundalini.
At that point. Yeah, I was having a major Kundalini experience. And it was blissful. You feel just so connected. I mean, it's just such an amazing space to be in without any medicine. This is a natural state that we can achieve. The medicine shows you it's a signpost, like this is what's possible. Then the work starts. You integrate the experience, and then we want to be working towards getting and achieving this level without medicine.
And that is integration, right? And that's where the hot cold thermogenesis and the breath work and the meditation and the yoga and all these practices, the diet and exercise and sleep, or even going back to your metaphor around the three stools. That's another framework in which to look at it. We embody this higher self when we're working with medicine, right? This connection to something greater, and then stress and deadlines and bills and taxes and all these things kind of bring us out of that. And yet for us to feel like we're at our greatest, it's often the question remains, how do we come back into that state? And so the way that I do it, or the way that I like to bring myself, are those morning rituals. With the Zen Mist, I'm glad you brought up the sauna, because that's also sometimes I'll go in the evening. Like I'll do that after our conversation today. I'm going to go sauna, do a little breath work, and do a little more Zen Mist just to come back into that space. And it's easy, it's clean, it doesn't burn like normal hape does, and it's been a great ritual.
And what's beautiful about the Zen Mist is it energizes you, but it's not something that'll keep you awake. Like if you were to have coffee this late, it's really going to disrupt your sleep. But, one of the utilities I found with the Zen is like if I'm at a cocktail party or if I'm out to dinner with friends, in like a social event, it kind of gets to that point. And I'm such an early riser anyway. Like sometimes I'm up at 4 a.m. And so people don't realize like I'm out and it's 9 o'clock or 9 p.m. Like that's like midnight to a lot of people. Right. So, I like having the Zen in my pocket because it just kind of brings me back for about 30 to 45 minutes. And then, of course, whenever you do that at a party, then people are like, "Oh, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Oh, here, come try this." And it's always a big hit. People absolutely love it.
Yeah, they do. Well, John, I want to thank you for all of the pioneering and inventive work that you're doing out of your clinic in Sarasota. There's a lot of things that you've invented, a lot of formulations and products, all the work that you've done with melatonin. When we had a chance to connect a few months ago, it just opened my mind to so much more. So I just want to thank you and express my appreciation for coming on the podcast and sharing your wealth of wisdom and knowledge and information with our audience. It's been, as I expected, a ton of fun.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure. I'm feeling grateful to be here with you as well and sharing this information. It's just important information to get out there. I feel compelled to support this movement that's happening. And I think that the more we can kind of wrap some science and creativity and some artwork to this, to continue to forward it, is going to do nothing but improve, this current situation that we're in. And it's going to require some hard work from a lot of us. So if any of this information helps anybody listening to forward that narrative, then, that's what I want.
And so if folks want to find out more, check out the melatonin book, just learn a little bit more about you and your work, where's the best website or resource to point them to?
Yeah. So our clinic website is advancedrejuvenation.us. And then I have an educational site called ultimatecellularreset.com as well, where we do some interviews. We have a YouTube channel. So those are probably the best.
Beautiful. So advancedrejuvenation.us is the clinic, and then ultimatecellularreset.com. And the melatonin book that you had mentioned can be found on ultimatecellularreset.com.
So melatoninbook.com will link to a page on ultimatecellularreset.com. So that page is all about the book, and you can read about it, and then you can go ahead and download it with the coupon code.
Perfect. Great. Well,
yeah, awesome.
Thanks again, John. This is awesome.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date on the third wave of psychedelics, subscribe to this channel and visit thethirdwave.co, where you'll find plenty of free resources on intentional and responsible psychedelic use.